Hi folks, welcome to class 6 of International NGOs, and as promised, this is a continuation of the discussion we started in our previous class, which is essentially looking at governance mechanisms in NGOs and how it relates to the notion of the state, the nation state in particular. So this is a bit of political theory, so please bear with me, but I promise you this is very important, and theoretically I think it is very rich in that it will help you place the context of the various debates in civil society and the nonprofit sector in context and help you analyze where does civil society really fit in, what are the relations of power between the state and civil society, and the various factors that go into balancing this delicate relationship. Hopefully at the end of these readings as well as this lecture, you'll be able to appreciate a little bit better the role of the state in managing this relationship and how it is increasing or decreasing given the context of globalization, as the Jessup reading points out. And also importantly, how does the freedom of nonprofits or other civil society organizations play out in today's contemporary society. And I'll focus a little bit on the US and also draw examples from Tunisia and other countries. So there are country reports that I've mentioned in the readings. Please have a look at them. So take a few minutes and make a note of anything that comes to your mind. But as far as indices of freedom for nonprofits, now can you think of any organizations that that have these sorts of indicators of how free nonprofits are in that particular country, or if there's a global scan? Take a few minutes and jot them down, and I'll give you a few seconds to pause, and then we can move on. As you're doing this, also think about how accurate you think those readings are, how accurate you think those assessments are in terms of measuring freedom. All right, let's move on. Hopefully you had a few guesses or hopefully correct answers. Now, with that in mind, let's really look at the framing questions which are important here, which are how much freedom should NGOs have? Like what determines the level of freedom that they should have? Should they have the power to challenge the government? Should they have the power to organize and protest? What kinds of protest is allowed? Should it be violent? Should it be non-violent? Should it be violent? What kinds of, and more importantly, who should determine that level of freedom? So these are some important questions as you think of various international contexts and how NGOs operate in those situations. Think of all these framing questions, and also in the light of various revolutions or other civil situations that have happened. Say take Egypt or Tunisia or other countries or Venezuela now. Look at what role are NGOs playing in these situations, and so I'll keep that as your background information as you move forward. So I want to spend a little bit of time on the Jessup reading. Basically, the way I saw this article was he offered a fairly decent analysis of the role of the state in the context of globalization, and I think this is a very important phenomenon, especially when one considers the role of transnational organizations in influencing the state as well as helping carry out agenda of development. As we have spoken about a few times earlier, nonprofit organizations, especially INGOs, can have an enormous impact also because they have a lot of resources, connections, social capital, and other forms of capital that they bring to the table. So they are a part of this globalization, the term globalization, which encompasses not just corporations, but in this case, you could also include nonprofit organizations in that. So if we think of NGOs in this context, which means that they are also competing for power with the state. And one of the things that Jessup does fairly well is to really draw the tension between what he calls the nation state or the national state. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the term distinction, nation state is anything that is based on a shared ethnic or cultural identity. So, look up his book, Benedict Anderson's very famous book called Imagined Communities. If you don't have the time to read the book, go through its synopsis or look up book reviews of this very, very important book on what forms a nation state and how did this idea of nation state come about. And the national state is a more legal entity. It's how, for instance, the United States defines itself legally, its borders, and various other factors. So one of the key arguments he makes is that the state shapes economic life. So in many, especially in a neoliberal context, the kind of economy that we are living in today, there is very little distinction between the market and the state. So the state uses the market to, in terms of a capitalist economy, to drive growth, to provide various services, and also to help it give legitimacy in terms of saying, okay, we're growing at this GDP level, hence the economy is doing well, and people are happy. So in that sense, the market becomes a justifying tool for the state also. One another very important point about this reading, which I think is important, is to look at the 6 key points he mentioned about transformation of the power of the nation state. Like what is really going on in terms of how is the state transforming in the context of globalization. So that's really what he's talking about here. And he gives these 6 ideas of how he calls them denationalization of state, rearticulating the economic and extra-economic, reordering political hierarchies. So I think the points he makes are fairly simple and straightforward. And I think if you pay close attention, you will completely understand what he's saying. And the moral of the story, or the crux of his argument here really, is that the state is not a stable entity in today's globalized context. Both political commitments, political communities, as well as the nature of what the state is meant to do. So he talks about the idea of a welfare state, or a context of a state which provides free healthcare, free education, things of that kind. So he says that is really retreating in the context of a marketized economy, and we see that playing out even in this current budget. If you've been paying attention with the Trump budget, which really slashing lots of public services. So that's another important point to remember, that the state itself is being redefined and its relationship with civil society. And of course, you're well aware that nonprofits in the US are not very happy with this current budget and the way the rhetoric of slashing of welfare is happening in the US itself. The other readings that I've included, I included this simply to give you a comparison in terms of how is philanthropic freedom really playing out in the context of these discourses. Now, we have an entire session on philanthropy, so we'll cover this more in depth. But I wanted to bring the notion of philanthropic freedom by this, the Hudson Institute people mean that how easily can people give money and how easily can they form nonprofit organizations. So as I have already mentioned to you guys earlier in the class, remittances, philanthropy are a big part of international aid that is coming from people. It's very different from the official development aid, what is called ODA, development assistance, sorry. So this private philanthropy, while it is significant and plays an important role, it is also subject to various legal constraints, both in the domestic context in the US and also internationally. And internationally, it's also subject to laws of that particular country. For instance, if Americans are sending money to Cuba or Venezuela, so this money is also subject to laws of that country, right? So it is a fairly complex mechanism. The moral of the story here again is that the higher the control, the less freedom there is. So control and freedom are inversely related, which means that the authors essentially argue that the freer the society, the less controls there are. So that's one of the important takeaways. And there are countries which have, in particular, cracked down on philanthropy: Russia, Turkey, Malaysia. Even though there is a push to engage diaspora narratives, diaspora contribution to the countries, they have cracked down recently because they feel they are interfering in the internal affairs of the country. So there's this other flip side to this story. Here's a quick snapshot from the report in terms of the amount of money given and also the philanthropic freedom. So as you can see, the US is fairly high up in terms of freedom and also the GDP, as well as other countries that are very lowly ranked, including Saudi Arabia, where the GDP is fairly high, but the freedom is almost nil. So some interesting observations here for you to notice. Another resource I want to point you guys to is the ICNL, based in Washington, D.C. They also produce reports on the freedom of nonprofit sector, and they particularly take a legal perspective. So spend some time on the website. Also look up their resources, and I hope you get some good insights from these resources. And again, I'm happy to chat with you guys about any of these resources or any of the ideas as it pertains to the state, freedom of the civil society to operate, and the changing dynamic of the state itself as it undergoes various local, domestic, as well as international transformations under the influence of various forces. Look at Brexit, for example, which is a very important phenomenon globally. Look at even the US itself, the kind of rhetoric that's coming out from this administration in terms of being exclusionary and being isolationist and not being the world leader that the US has aspired to be since the World War II. So these are important changes which might have huge ramifications going forward. So I think it's a good time if we are studying these issues, and we can start paying a little more attention to these nuances, in particular about governance issues and relation of the state with civil society, both from a legal as well as other perspectives. Thank you, and hope to see you soon.